Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, a consumer education conversation. This is the second in a three-part series, and we're so glad to have you here with us today. While folks are getting signed in, I'm going to start with some introductions. I'm Sarah Diamond, the Director of Partner Success at Child Care Aware of America. Our mission is to advance a child care system that effectively serves all children and families. And our work is strengthened by a national network of child care resource and referral agencies and diverse members and partners. We're honored to support our members in becoming a trusted resource in their communities. And we're really appreciative of all of our members who are joining us today. We have a couple of housekeeping announcements that we'd like to share with you. And this is important for your participation in the presentation today. First of all, you may have noticed that our lines are muted during the presentation. However, we very much want you to participate with us. You will have an opportunity to answer some poll questions, and we would encourage you to use the questions box throughout the presentation. You'll find that questions box along with a handout for the presentation in your GoToWebinar control panel. We're going to be monitoring your questions throughout the presentation, so please do feel free to share with us. Secondly, we wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available for viewing at a later time. And finally, we wanted to let you know that we're extending a special invitation to all of you who are participating live with us to join in a follow-up discussion. And you will hear more information about how you can participate that at the conclusion of this presentation. Before I introduce our presenters, I also wanted to draw attention that in the presentation, there's also a slide that includes information about our membership. So if you are not yet a member of Child Care Aware of America and you would like more information about that, please do reference that slide. And there's a nice downloadable one-page PDF that shares more about the benefits of our membership. I'd like to introduce our experts, Jessica Reed and Victoria Valou from Child Care Aware of America. Jess has been with Child Care Aware of America since 2010, assisting families with child care consumer education, as well as military fee assistance programs. She develops content, provides training, and oversees all website updates and maintenance. Joining her is Victoria Valou, who's been with Child Care Aware of America since 2009, overseeing the National Child Care Consumer Education and Referral Hotline and website. She plays an integral role in the DoD Military Child Care Fee Assistance Program. And we're so grateful to have both Jessica and Victoria bring us this important information and share with us today. Jess is going to get us started.
We're going to get started today with a couple of quick polls. If you participated in last time's webinar, this first one will be familiar. But for everyone out there, we'd love to hear what your current role is so we have an idea of who's joining us this time. So we'll go ahead and launch that poll. We'll give you just a minute to select your answer.
All right, and this is Sarah again. As our poll is wrapping up, if you haven't yet cast your vote, please do. But I wanted to thank those of you who also chatted in or indicated in the questions box your roles. So to add to the poll, we also have a caseworker, an auditor, as well as joint referral specialist.
Thanks, Sarah. So it looks like the majority are child care resource and referral specialists. Once again, although we do have some child care resource and referral directors and supervisors and state network staff, as well as those that Sarah has mentioned. So we're actually going to launch a second poll now. And what we'd like to know this time is if there are returning guests from the first webinar in the series, or whether this is your first time joining us. Thanks so much for your responses. Looks like the majority are returning, although we do have a good percentage of first-timers with us. We're glad to have both returning guests and first-timers here, and we hope that each one of you will come away with a fresh perspective on engaging families in the child care search process. Our webinar objectives today are to enhance understanding of how a conversational approach to consumer education can lead to true consumer engagement, and to review actual strategies for engaging families in the process of choosing quality child care. And with that said, we'll jump right into a quick review of consumer education versus consumer engagement. In the previous webinar, we heard great feedback from many of you on what you see as consumer education and how that's different from consumer engagement. We want to make sure we all understand the difference between the two this time as well, and why that distinction is important. So you can think of consumer education as a toolkit of basic information and resources that a family needs for their child care search. This information is shared with families to help them be informed consumers. The first webinar in this series focused on consumer education and reviewed what could be included as part of the toolkit. We've included some examples here on this slide. While we can view consumer education as the toolkit itself, consumer engagement is going to go several steps further with a couple of key components highlighted here. First, consumer engagement is working together with the family to determine how the toolkit can work for their individual needs. So the family is seen as a partner in this work because they are the expert on their family and child needs and what will work for them. Rather than the one-way flow of information, consumer engagement must be relationship-based. And the second component is that consumer engagement is equipping the family with knowledge and confidence to move forward and engage with the process of finding and choosing quality child care. As you know, this webinar will focus more on consumer engagement. So let's do a quick comparison of the two. Consumer education is one-directional or a one-way sharing of information. The sharer, who in this situation would be the referral specialist, takes on the role of teacher, and the caller would be the learner. It can be static, as really any interaction could look about the same, and it's teacher-focused, meaning that the referral specialist in the role of teacher really takes the lead and sets the pace. Compared to consumer engagement, which goes two ways and ideally is interactive, both parties take turns being a teacher because they both can add value as experts, the specialist on quality child care and the family on their child and family needs. It's dynamic, and by that we mean that each interaction looks different and should be open to change based on how the circumstances are unfolding. And it's much more family focused as the specialist works to bring out the parent's expertise and elicit their involvement as much as possible. So why does consumer engagement matter when helping families find child care? Really, it comes down to the type of consumer you're helping to cultivate. When we're engaging with families, we're creating a level playing field where both parties are open to learning and sharing. This kind of environment helps the parent or family member to feel valued, feel heard, and feel capable and confident. You're beginning to form that relationship needed to work together toward your goal, and you're creating a safe place for them to learn about childcare. When the parent feels safe to participate and ask questions during this first step of finding childcare, our hope is that they'll be more likely to continue to engage in the process of choosing a quality childcare program rather than simply being a passive consumer.
There are many different engagement strategies that your organization may choose to put into practice, but the one we're going to focus on for the remainder of this presentation is conversation. Before we talk about how conversation can be a strategy for engagement, we'd like to hear your thoughts. So we'd like to know if you can think of any challenges with this strategy. And what we mean by that is, why might it be easier to simply monologue or lecture on consumer ed rather than intentionally having a back and forth consumer ed conversation? So go ahead and use the questions box to submit your thoughts. And we'll give you a minute or so, and then we'll have Sarah read them out loud for us.
So Jess and Victoria, some of the responses that are coming in are related to time. So time constraints or time restrictions. Also, the fact that two-way conversation takes more time, although it is more beneficial, as someone has noted as well. So time is definitely one of the biggest considerations or challenges. Another is that the participants might not engage when you try to have that conversation. Some other responses include that they may have distractions going on, such as children in the background, and so you want to be sure that they can attend to the children's needs. So it may be that you're sensing it's not the best time for them to engage in that conversation. And then as another example, someone has indicated that there could be some language barriers.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing. Those are all challenges that could occur while using this strategy. A few other challenges that might occur could include that the parent might get sidetracked from the main goal of the conversation, and that could very well be because there's distractions in the background like the children. Sometimes it could feel risky to allow someone else to drive that conversation. For some, it could almost be scary that it's out of their control. We definitely have here that it takes longer, so time definitely. And the specialists may be worried about being able to hit all their required checklist points if they're required to mention a certain amount of things in one conversation. So even though there are challenges to opening up consumer ed to be a conversation, we are going to talk about why it's worth it and what this type of conversation could look like. So when thinking about conversational versus lecture style consumer ed, we need to remember that in this type of work, we may only get one opportunity to work with a family during their childcare search. And we're going to be trying to do a few different things during this interaction. We are trying to gather information from the family that we need in order to complete their childcare search for them. We also want to equip them with tools and knowledge to choose a quality program, and we hope to kickstart their engagement in the childcare search process. We know that a one-way lecture or a read-through of consumer education website can equip a family with tools and knowledge. And we know an online childcare search feature can gather information about a family to perform a targeted childcare search. And in the absence of a personal guide, these two options are helpful to have around. But a conversation with a childcare expert can do all three of these things: gather information about the family, equip them with tools and knowledge, and engage them in the process. The big difference is that you, as the expert, are capable of interacting, reading a situation, using critical thinking, and encouraging engagement. Obviously, websites and online search features just don't share those human abilities. And if we choose to lecture rather than to dialogue, we're missing out on opportunities that we have to do more for our families. The concept of a conversation will seem pretty simple, right? It's people talking to one another. But what we want to do now is really pull it apart and discuss some key components of a successful consumer ed conversation that all of our interactions should display. You can see here that these components will include building trust, active listening, asking the right questions, and customizing your consumer education. We'll talk about each one of these over the next few slides. So building trust. The first component of any relationship is building trust. Of course, the relationship that you have with the families you work with is unique in that it has the potential to be very short-lived, only as long as a phone call or a chat or an in-person visit. Because of this, you must already have your foundation in place for trust building. Your relationship with the parent will depend in a large part on your mindset and your commitment. This all begins before you even pick up the phone, answer a chat, or schedule an in-person meeting. Without the right mindset, trust is going to be hard to come by. If we see parents as passive consumers who come to us just for a list of childcare programs, that's what they're going to get from us. But if we see parents as experts on their child and family and as wanting the best for their child, we begin to understand why they are a valuable partner in this process. And when we remember that no one likes to feel unconfident or uninformed going into a new situation, then we realize that we play a special role in this parent's childcare search. We're the ones who can stand by them, and with our assistance and our words, let them know you can do this. Let's work together to get you to the right solution. So before we even begin an interaction with the family, we must be committed to certain things. We need to be committed to partnering with the parent, and this includes remembering that we're not the only expert in the conversation and making sure we bring the parent into the conversation in ways designed to draw out their expertise. This next one might seem obvious, but it's crucial. We also need to commit to critical evaluation of our tone. The tone of voice that we use in person and over the phone and the tone we project via email or chat communicates by itself, regardless of what we're saying. Our tone should be welcoming, friendly, respectful, and confident. We need to be committed to digging deep into our expertise. When we show that we're going the extra mile, the parent sees that and begins to trust that we're doing all we can do for them. So for an example, if the parent has a unique scheduling need and we take the time to truly learn about what they'll need and brainstorm creative options that can meet that need, we're sending them the signal that they're not just one of many, but that we see their family and their child and understand just how important this is for them. We must consider where the parent is coming from and work with them from that place. We must commit to showing empathy, to really putting ourselves in a parent's shoes, and to being sensitive and responsive to their cultural needs and desires. This carries with it a charge to be self-aware, especially if the family's background differs from yours. And it's also important to gain an understanding of the cultural makeup of your service area. And lastly, we must commit to using strengths-based communication. This means communicating to the family, both verbally and non-verbally, that they've taken great steps already, encouraging them on the steps they've yet to take, and helping them to see that their contributions are important and valuable. Families are our children's first and most important teachers, and they have expertise about their child and family that nobody else has. Reminding families of these things gives them confidence and encourages them to stay engaged in this process. We mentioned before that we don't get a lot of time to build trust with the parents we serve, but we can do all of these things in the span of a conversation, and collectively they can go a very long way.
The second component of the conversation is active listening. We've broken active listening down into some additional actions and considerations here, and we'll look at each of these separately. So first we'll discuss the initial considerations when contact is made of listening to both the text and the subtext. Then we'll talk about some ways to show the family that you're listening, and lastly, some actions that you might take based on what you're hearing within the conversation. First, we'll think about that initial contact. When contact is made with a parent, active listening should begin immediately. Often they'll jump right in with their story, and you may not have a chance to do some of the initial intake you'd normally do until much later in the conversation. Regardless, as soon as the parent is on the line or in person, start listening for both the text and the subtext. The text is going to be the clear surface level information. So did they mention how many children they have that need child care? Did they mention their ages or the type of care they're looking for? Did they say when they need to begin or mention any specific needs they'll have? If needed, take notes to ensure you can capture as much of this as possible. Sometimes it's hard to take it all in and you may have to go back and ask again later, but the more you're able to gather from this initial contact, the more you'll be able to show the family that you heard them and you're paying attention to their needs. The subtext is a bit more difficult to get sometimes because it really involves reading between the lines. You're listening to what the parent says, but also to what they don't say. The subtext may give you some ideas for questions to ask later or ways that you can put a parent's mind at ease. For example, let's say the mother of an infant calls in and she's requesting help finding childcare for her new baby, but she also mentions that she's nervous about putting her baby in childcare. Now, she didn't necessarily state why she's nervous, but from your experience, you know it's normal to be anxious about being away from the baby for the first time, maybe placing a child in the care of a non-relative or friend, or even from hearing stories of others' negative experiences with a baby in childcare. Whether or not the parent shares any of this with you, you can take it and use it. You could tell the parent that it's completely normal to be anxious about their child's first time in childcare, and that you're going to go over some tools with her that can help her to choose a safe place and one that can help her to have peace of mind while she's away from her child. You could also go over some ways that she can navigate the transition to childcare, like making more than one visit to the program she chooses, starting out with a few half days, and maybe transitioning to full days slowly, or even visiting on her lunch break if possible to breastfeed or check in, and things like that. By listening to both the text and the subtext, you're showing a parent that you're listening on more than one level, and that all of the information, from their specific needs to their feelings about the process, is important.
Along the way, it's also important to show the parent that you're listening, and you can do this in easy ways. You can repeat back what the parent has said by saying, okay, I heard you say you're looking for overnight childcare for 2 children. Is that correct? And you can also provide small interjections that show you're present, whether you give a simple as the parent is talking or whatever comes naturally to you. The parent needs to know that you're still there taking it all in. It can be disconcerting when you've been talking for a little while and then you start to wonder if the person on the other end is still listening or even there. It can be easy for us to be in the intake mode where we're thinking about the next step or what information still needs to be collected in order to do a childcare search. But do your best to remain present to what the parent is saying. Then when you get a chance, you can begin to fill in the gaps that you still need in order to move forward with their search. And lastly, active listening will help you to determine if you need to adjust your delivery at all. Every family is different, so some are going to breeze right along with you, and some are going to need a slower pace. You might get a ways through your consumer education and realize the parent was lost 5 minutes ago, and you need to backtrack entirely. Often when that happens, it's a great idea to summarize what you've talked about so far, and maybe even explain it in a step-by-step process for how they can use all the information you already discussed. We've had chats before when we might get all the way to offering information about quality indicators and then realize we need to go all the way back to step 1. So we might summarize similar to step 1, you're going to contact your CCR&R to request a list of childcare programs. Step 2, once you have the list, you can look up inspection reports for the ones you're interested in. Step 3, and so on. And in addition to adjusting your speed, you may need to adjust the depth that you go into. If a family tells you that they're on their lunch break, you'll need to consider that time constraint when determining how much to share. If you can hear that they're driving with kids in the back seat, you may need to be respectful of the amount of attention they're able to provide at this moment. Or if they have really insightful questions and show a lot of interest in every topic, you can do a deep dive on certain things you might not normally pursue. It's all about listening to the parent's words as well as their tone, speed, interest level, and availability, and then making a judgment about what you can offer that best meets their current needs. So what if, as you're practicing your active listening, you sense a pretty clear lack of interest? First of all, as with any other factor, if interest level is an issue, you'll need to adapt. Don't force the conversation to be something the parent clearly doesn't want, because you'll risk losing the parent even faster if you do that. You can still have a conversation with a parent who's not interested in consumer ed. You can continue to offer the information, but if they decline, move along. However, don't assume that if they decline one piece, they'll decline them all. And of course, if all else fails, you still have a follow-up engagement opportunity to provide resources to the family, whether that's a follow-up call or email packet or something else. One suggestion we have for families who seem disinterested is not to offer consumer education in a way that allows them to decline everything at once. So here's a good example. If you were to ask, would you like more information on choosing a quality childcare program? But what you really mean is, do you want information on licensing, inspections, quality ratings, quality indicators, childcare credentials, etc.? A parent could simply say no. And they've unknowingly turned down loads of valuable information. We would recommend instead offering consumer ed in bits and pieces, maybe starting with some information about licensing and inspections, then moving on to quality ratings and what those mean, then encouraging an in-person visit and offering to go over some quality indicators, or however you structure your conversation. But overall, remember that there will be some families that just have priorities and needs, and will choose instead to focus on getting a list of providers with no additional guidance. So it's up to us to respect their decision and hopefully still give the chance to pass along all the other resources in the follow-up email.
The third, and maybe one of the most practical ways to engage in a conversation, is to learn how to ask the right questions. We're going to look at some specific examples of this over the next few slides, but first we've come up with a few general guidelines for the questions that we ask during our consumer ed conversations. We recommend keeping questions fairly specific, as sometimes questions that are too general can end up having a negative effect on the conversation. For example, we've seen the effects of the general question, do you know what to look for when visiting a child care program? And we've noticed that typically it has the effect of making parents feel like they're being quizzed. So in response to a do you know what to look for question, some parents simply say yes. And then you end up moving on without actually knowing if you and the parent are on the same page about what to look for. Or in other instances, we've heard the parents start listing off a bunch of things to look for, which isn't necessarily always productive. So we'd recommend a more specific set of questions which can have a more positive effect. For example, there are a number of things you should be looking for during your visit. Would you like to go over some of those things with me? We'd also recommend asking customized questions that take into account what you've already learned from the parent and what you still need to know in order to provide the right set of consumer education information. And your questions should also be thoughtful. And by this, we mean that your questions should be sensitive and responsive to the family's cultural and home values, and they should be posed in a way that takes the parent's interest level, experiences, and needs into account. Once again, this includes using what you've learned through active listening, building on any answers the parent has already given, and taking the speed and depth considerations into account as well. So keeping those guidelines in mind, we're going to now take a look at some specific examples of types of questions to ask during a consumer ed conversation. One of the most obvious types of questions that you're going to ask to engage with the parent is about their needs. They may have already shared some of these things with you earlier in the conversation, and you can confirm them using active listening skills. But whatever gaps you still have, be sure to learn as much about the parent's needs as you can so that you can not only customize your child care referral list, but also your consumer education. We'll think more about customizing your consumer ed in a few slides. Some examples of this type of question are, does your child have any special needs or other considerations we should take into account when searching for child care? How many children do you have that need child care and what are their ages? Do you have any questions about this information so far? And with that one, even a brief check-in question can take their needs into account and help you to gauge whether you need to adjust your delivery at all. And this last example, will you need a program that can transport to your child's school? So if you were using your active listening skills, you could ask this question if a parent has already mentioned they have a school-age child. And of course, there are many more questions you might ask about a family's child care needs.
You should also ask questions that invite parents to share about previous experiences and preferences. Learning about a parent's previous experiences with childcare will help to guide your consumer education later on. So for example, if they're new to the childcare scene, you're going to structure your consumer ed very differently than if you're speaking with a parent that has already sent 3 children through childcare, or if you are speaking to someone who is an early educator themselves. Or if a parent has had a negative experience with a child care center and would like to avoid centers moving forward, you'll want to know that in order to find the right options, but also to include some way to evaluate a family child care home for safety and quality. Or let's say they have a preference for only child care centers, but you know that it's going to be difficult to find centers that open before 6 a.m., which is what the parent needs. You may need to recognize this preference while also making them aware of the limitations they may face. and then have a discussion on whether they would like to expand their search radius or whether they would like to go over some ways that you can help them evaluate family child care homes so they can find an environment that they feel comfortable with. Some examples of this type of question could include, is this your first time looking for child care? What kind of child care programs have you used in the past? And do you have a preference for which type of child care you'd like to use, or do you need more information on the types that are available? And the last type of question that we'll discuss is a question that draws out participation in a topic that you could have simply lectured on. The other types of questions we discussed were focused on learning about the family and helping to guide the information and resources that we'll be providing for them. But these questions are ones that we try to incorporate right into our consumer ed. When delivering consumer ed, it's easy to kind of launch into a lecture mode once the initial intake is over with. There's a lot of information to cover, and it may not be intuitive to think about keeping the family engaged when the information seems to need to come from the top down. But a simple way to do this is to take some of your consumer ed statements and turn them into questions to involve the parent. So instead of, you should always visit a child care program in person, you can try, have you ever visited a child care program before? Not only does this provide a touch point for the parent to stay engaged, but you also learn whether this is going to be their first child care visit or their 10th. Or instead of, you can find child care inspection reports online, you can try, have you had the opportunity to review a child care inspection report? And that can lead you nicely into a discussion about where to find inspection reports in your state and what kind of information they'll find there. Or this last example, instead of, it is important to evaluate the quality of a program during your in-person visit, we would recommend looking for the following things. You could try, I'm sure you already have certain questions you'd like to ask each child care provider. Would you like to go over a few that we recommend asking? So with this, you're creating yet another touch point with the family and also giving them the opportunity to help set the pace and depth of information they're receiving. If they say no, then of course you can offer to email this information so they can review it at their own convenience.
And that brings us to our final component of a consumer ed conversation, which is customizing your consumer ed. This is you taking the value that the parent added to the conversation and turning it into that consumer ed toolkit just for them. What you're doing here is starting with a preset menu of information and referral supports, and then individualizing it based on families' expressed needs. By making sure that each family receives the full spectrum of information, we're working to provide equitable services across the board. For example, when you're discussing types of child care, you'll need to consider if the parent said they have a preference for a type of care. If they do, and you think you can provide them with those referrals, you can tell them a bit more about just the type of care they'd like to use. Or if you know you won't be able to meet their needs with the referrals available, You may need to cover other types of childcare and explain why those may be better options for the family's needs. If the family has no preference, you can go over any type you feel they should know about and which type might provide which benefits. And of course, if your state or local area has other options that may be a good fit based on a child's age, you could add in information on state pre-K programs or Head Start. When you're moving into licensing information, you'll want to take into account if they're familiar with licensing, because you may need to address some misconceptions about what licensing means, or you may need to explain it in simple terms. If parents have questions about certain regulations, that can change the shape of your discussion. Or if someone shares a previous negative experience, you might want to discuss certain licensing regulations that they could look for or ask about that could set their mind at ease in the next program. Quality indicators are a great place for customizing consumer ed because there's so much variation in what you could share. Depending on the age of the child or children, the information on recommended ratio and group size will look different. If they're an infant, you'd want to share safe sleep recommendations and requirements. Or if they're considering a certain type of care, that will affect not only ratio and group size components, but also some indoor and outdoor environment considerations, national accreditation information, and more. And the last example is other resources that you might share with a parent. So do they need resources for a child with special needs? Would they like to apply for child care assistance? Could they use information on other types of assistance programs? You can see that there are so many factors that will affect how each conversation unfolds. Specialists will really need to be able to think on their feet and be comfortable enough with all of the information that they can create a customized package for each family that comes through. Now we have another opportunity for you to share your thoughts and experiences. This time we'd love to hear from you in the questions box about any additional ways that you might have to customize your consumer education. This could be something that you've done for a parent before, or even just an idea about what parents might need from us at some point. Again, we'll give you some time to think and to chat in your responses, and as some results come in, we'll have Sarah read them out loud for us.
All right, so some of the thoughts that are coming in, one is related to whether or not a provider has transportation to and from home. Along those lines, whether or not a provider is on a public bus line, so kind of related to transportation. We also have a suggestion where someone gives each parent a referral packet that has specific information about their county and other parent support groups. So that's a nice way to customize. Continue to see some responses related to transportation, such as school drop-off, food allergies was another suggestion of a way to customize that conversation. We also had someone indicate that after an intake has been completed, they mail out a children's book along with consumer education. So that might be a nice idea for some of you. And then I'll read just one or two more. Another one that I don't know that we've talked about just yet is whether or not there are overnight shifts that would be required, and that might be helpful for finding the right childcare program. And then another is if the provider has expertise in caring for children with special needs. So thank you all for the suggestions that you've contributed.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for reading those aloud, Sarah, and thanks everyone for chatting in some of your thoughts. Those definitely are some great examples of ways to customize both your referrals and your consumer ed. And of course, I'm sure given more time, you could think of dozens more.
All right, so that's what we have for you around using conversation as an engagement strategy. But what we didn't want to wrap up without acknowledging that this is just one of many engagement strategies that organizations can choose to implement. During our last webinar, many of you shared that you conduct follow-up emails and calls, as well as regular check-ins, which are another great way to engage families in this process. We know many agencies also do informational events for families who may not call or email, and that's a great way to engage other learning styles as well. We're sure there are others of you out there who have some really creative and successful strategies your agency uses to engage with families, and all of those are important and valuable. We hope that this discussion around engagement through conversation will simply add to what you're already doing to serve families and children every day. Now we do have some time to take some questions, so we'll, if you wanted to go ahead and use the question section to type in any questions that you may have for us. Sarah will read some out loud. If any of them don't get answered, don't worry, we'll make sure that every single question is responded to through the Basecamp discussion.
And Jess or Victoria, while we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, I'm noticing that some of the conversation has been around customizing that conversation for children with special needs. And I wondered if you might want to also share about the third webinar in this series that will be coming up in the month of May.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Sarah. Our next webinar, I believe, is May 16th, and it's on customizing your consumer education for families with children with special needs. So we'll be talking about some really specific topics and also just some additional resources that we may add in for those families, why some of their needs are different in addition to simply their child's special needs. So we'll be covering a number of topics, and we hope that many of you will come back and join us for that one as well.
Great. So one of the questions that we have is, how have other people had success with follow-up calls to see if a parent received care? So this was from Michelle, who shared that they're struggling a little bit with parents calling their agency back.
So for the work that we do, because we're not actually providing referrals to child care providers, we don't do follow-up calls, but I'm wondering if there's any other specialists who would like to throw some answers into the chat box that we could share.
That would be great. Another question is, do you have resources or suggestions for families of different cultures and languages that you could share?
Currently, our organization only has English and Spanish. We've used a translation line in the past, but our materials are only translated into Spanish, no other languages. I do think it's a great opportunity if there are other agencies on the line here that have additional languages that they may want to share. Post those on the Basecamp discussion group or chat here now. But right now, unfortunately, we only serve English and Spanish. It would definitely be a dream to add some more languages on.
Mm-hmm. So some of the follow-ups that others are sharing that they might have with families is that some parents prefer email to phone calls for follow-ups because then they're able to answer when they're available. So that, we thank you for sharing that idea, Kristen. And Jamie Lee added that their agency found emails work really well for a while, although it's starting to slow down a little bit. Another suggestion was mailing postcards or possibly doing a follow-up survey and also letting families know in advance that we'll be following up with them. So some good suggestions. I am checking to see. It looks like there was also another suggestion from Natalie that said using a Google Voice account to text the parent without having to use a cell phone. So it sounds like they're leveraging some technology to be able to support their work as well. And we have another example of someone following up with a text message to families as well. So some great ideas and strategies that others are using in following up. So another question was related to whether or not some of this information can be used for local training of CCR&R staff. And we did address this on our first webinar as well. We absolutely encourage you to use this information. And we are going to provide some contact information on one of the final slides as well. So if you need some added support, then we welcome you to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to help you think about ways that you could use this information. There was one other question, somewhat related to follow-up. This was specifically asking, with so many families completing online referrals, what strategies have people found to engage parents when they're using an online format? So perhaps, Connie, some of the strategies that we saw or that we heard from others earlier would be helpful for that. But does anyone have anything specific to share when their families are completing online referrals, ways in which maybe they have tried to engage that are different than those that we've already talked about?
While people are putting some answers into the chat, we wanted to share one of the strategies that we have used is using an online chat feature, so a live chat feature for those who aren't able to call in for whatever reason, but are visiting the website and using some of the resources, we have the chance to reach them through our chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
No, excuse me. I was just going to share that Courtney also wrote in that they recommend CCR&R staff follow up with phone calls to the families that register in the online portal. So, and then there's a couple follow-ups to that. It's either to call or to email or to text the families, you know, depending on what their preference might be. And then there was another suggestion from Kristen who shared that when parents aren't able to pull their referrals for whatever reason, they will follow up with them and send them a list of providers. So that's a little extra support that's being offered in the event that families are having difficulty with the online search. And then it looks like Jamie Lee has shared an example that for them, they have a form that can be completed online that goes directly to her agency, and they send out an email first to try to reach out to them or possibly leave a voicemail. But they try to let them know if they're leaving a voicemail that they've also sent an email out to folks. So those are a couple of suggestions for families who are completing online referrals.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. We just want to touch base real quick about the follow-up Basecamp discussion. So following this webinar, you will receive an email that contains a link to Basecamp where we'll continue our discussion. Some of you have already joined us, but for those who haven't had a chance to log in yet, when you do log in, the first thing you're going to see is this colorful page. This is actually a screenshot from the current discussion. And this is the landing page. There's 4 different options, but for this series, we will be mainly using the message board as well as the docs and files. When you open the message board, you're going to see the current discussion threads, which you can just join. You can also start your own thread as well. We do encourage that. Under the Docs and Files section, you're going to find copies of the webinar slides, any resources we discussed in the webinar, and other relevant resources. We also heard both in the first webinar as well as this one that many folks want to use this as a training opportunity for their staff, and we do encourage that. We will be sending out the PowerPoint slides, but as you probably heard as we went through the presentation, we shared a lot of examples verbally. So what we're going to do is add many of those examples to Basecamp. So if you're looking for some supplement material to help come up with your own training with the slides, make sure you go to the Basecamp so you can pull some of those examples to use. All right, we look forward to continuing the discussion, and I'll let Sarah wrap us up.
Well, thank you so much, Jess and Victoria, for sharing this information with us. We have seen through the questions box, some folks have been chatting their appreciation for this content and how they might use this information. So we really appreciate your time and putting this information together for us today. For those of you who joined us, we're so appreciative of your participation. We're grateful for the responses that you chatted in. It sounds like you really enjoy hearing those ideas from one another. So just another opportunity for you to go and join in that Basecamp conversation so that you can continue to learn from your peers and dialogue with one another around some of these critical strategies to support families. And then we also have included some contact information, so do feel free to reach out to us using our email address, which is learnmore@usa.childcareaware.org. And there are also some links in the presentation where you can read more about our membership and also check out our blog, which is another great resource for all of you. We are so appreciative of your time. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll be joining us for our final webinar in this series coming up in May. Please have a wonderful day.